Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we know our keynote speaker is pulling up, so we should be right on time in terms of getting our welcome done. As mentioned, my name is Boris Lushniak. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Health here at the University of Maryland, and welcome you to this teach-in on activism to prevent gun violence. Anytime we talk about guns, and I got to sort of preface this by saying that what we're dealing with today is gun violence. We'll dabble with this idea of how we want to achieve the prevention aspect of gun violence. And certainly achieving that goal is what riles people oftentimes, right? That's where we get into the world of sort of talking about Second Amendment. What does it say? What does it doesn't say? We instill on this idea of America as, traditionally a gun-bearing nation. I take this from a perspective of a public health expert. And as a public health expert, anything that kills and maims the population, anything that inflicts harm upon that population becomes a public health matter. And what I want us to focus on is the public health approach to this. The co-moderator today is Dr. Woody Kessel. Woody is a well-known public health authority. Like I formerly wore a uniform of the uniformed services of our nation as an officer in the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, was also a Rear Admiral, as was I. And we spent many years in government service working on that aspect of what the public health perspective on many issues are. And some people would criticize us saying, well, you're bringing into the University of Maryland yet another issue that somehow is going to be divisive. Right? A lot of people in public health describe this as infamously a third rail discussion. Oh, don't go there. Don't talk about it. Having had that government service in the federal government perspective of public health leads me to actually tackle this issue more head-on than ever. Once again, simple little formula. We're going to hear from people who include survivors, people who include losing loved ones. Right? There's pain in this room, and as I mentioned, when you look at the information out there, our nation is being hurt by something. And the question is, what do we do about it? Right? We jump to the conclusion that it's all about gun control. Oh my God, he just mentioned the gun control question. I don't know. Right? We're at a stage right now that we have to do something, and that's why we have this discourse. So, with that brief introduction, we look at this forum with a goal. It's a national goal: eliminate gun violence. Gun violence as a leading cause of preventable injury and death in the United States. Our teach-in goal today is present different avenues of activism and community engagement and discuss how we can come together to end gun violence and support those most impacted by trauma and violence. So I welcome you, the audience. I welcome those on the electronic beams going out, hopefully to hundreds of individuals out there, to our panelists, and we'll soon be welcoming and introducing our keynote speaker, Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland's 8th District, a member of the House of Representatives Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. We also have a group here from the Riderwood Retirement Village, guests of ours here at the university who come in with their own level of activism. We'd like to hear from you as part of our discourse. Now I'd like to introduce Woody Kessel, professor of the practice here at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. As I mentioned, a retired Assistant Surgeon General of the United States Public Health Service, who's going to set us up with some background information. Thank you so much, Woody, for playing a key role in putting all this together.
Boris, thank you. This is working, good. Boris, thank you so much, and thank you to the entire School of Public Health family for participating in this. As the Dean said, we view this as a public health problem. We view this as we did learning about cigarette smoking. Learning about, it may have taken us 50 years to make that kind of progress, But when the Surgeon General of the United States identified with evidence, a very important element in this process, that cigarette smoking is harmful to your health. And we've gone on from there. It's taken a long time. We've done some other things in public health. Vehicular safety, reducing crashes. And there we had some difficulty with industry, getting people to comply and working on that. But now virtually everybody wears a seatbelt. And even though there's some controlling elements, I'm proud to say as a pediatrician that it's usually the children in the family that remind mom and dad and other people getting in the car, you need to buckle up. So very important. And that's the framework. But my task this afternoon is not only to come in and have a seat. We're happy you're here. Thank you. Certainly we have a terrific group of folks who are going to share their thoughts, and folks online, and the Riderwood people, and all the faculty, and the students, and the people electronically. But what I want to share with you is just some background information. Oh, good. You're able to do that without me. This is public health. We always start with the data, with the evidence, with the background material. This is data from the Centers for Disease Control, 2017, the latest data that we have. You can look at these numbers and you see, 170,000 plus. And I want to start with that. 170,000 plus per year are people who are wounded, who are shot, right? This is the equivalent of 1,000 airplanes. 1,000 airplanes a year crashing. Then we move on into, fortunately, not every event is fatal. And then we start to see what the fatal events lead us to and what we can learn about that. And the fatal events include homicide. It's about 40% homicide. 60% are people taking their own lives. There's a smaller number related to, quote, legal interventions. And then there's the one where my career started. Unintentional injury. A child thinks that a weapon is a toy, plays with it, and an 8-year-old shoots their 5-year-old brother, sister. And I've taken care of those children some 45 years ago, and it brought me to this point. And then what we want to do with this, and we're not going to go over all of this data and information, but as public health people, the original premise in understanding how to deal with tobacco, how to deal with automobile injuries, how to deal with any of the public health threats is to get the data with enough granularity that we can intervene with some interventions that make some sense. And I'm going to close with this chair. And this chair, for us, this empty chair, is to signify all of those folks that have suffered gunshot wounds, that have lost their lives, that are not here with us today. And it's particularly important for me because I sit on a family foundation board in memory of one of the children murdered in Newtown, Aviel Richmond. Aviel was a delightful 6-year-old, went off to school, first grade, didn't come home that day. As tragic as that is, about a month ago, her dad, who was a neuroscientist, we're working on trying to understand the biology here, took his own life. Clearly, Jeremy struggling with issues, but it certainly points out the complexity of this, the sustained trauma and consequence that everybody suffers from. And many of you, in some way or other, have been touched with this kind of violence and these kinds of circumstances. And in addition to this data, we really want to drill down even further. Where does all of this start in the community? With poverty, with homelessness, with a whole series of things that we want to learn and understand so we can be smart and thoughtful about effective ways to stop this epidemic in this country. Our special guest is here, and Dean Lushniak is going to introduce Congressman Raskin to us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Woody. It's my pleasure right now, and it's always great having someone from the House of Representatives here to give a perspective. As Dean of the School of Public Health, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jamie Raskin, Congressman from Maryland's 8th District. Key membership of the House of Representatives, specifically on the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jamie Raskin.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you like to roam? Do you want to hold?
No, this is fine. I can be here.
All right.
Well, I'm delighted to be with everyone and to take a couple minutes to tell you some good news from Washington. We did pass, I think, the toughest gun safety legislation that Congress has passed in at least a decade to close the gun show loophole, close the internet loophole, and the whole private sale, parking lot of 7-Eleven loophole by saying that all firearm sales have to be accompanied by a criminal and mental background check. So we were able to get that done 6 weeks ago, and unfortunately it was along party lines, or pretty much party lines. Maybe a few Republicans joined us, but every Democrat voted for it. This is legislation which is favored by 97% of the American people. It's remarkable that you have a near unanimous public consensus around doing this. And it's basically everybody in the country, the vast majority of Democrats, of Republicans, of independents, of gun owners, of non-gun owners, everybody agrees it just doesn't make sense to allow people to purchase firearms unless they can pass a criminal and mental background check. So there's just a handful of people who oppose it. Unfortunately, they're running the U.S. Senate and are in the White House, and so nothing has gone forward on this. And so this is cause for major public action, I think, to try to put pressure on the Senate president, on Mitch McConnell, to bring it to the floor so there can at least be a vote on it, and to present it to the president so that presumably he could sign it and we can do it. It just doesn't make any sense to continue to have these gaping loopholes in the law that exist. We also reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act and had very strong provisions in there about removing guns from domestic offenders and people who against whom a restraining order has been issued. So again, the NRA tried to stop us there, but we were able to pass this in the House of Representatives. Again, we're waiting for the Senate to act on it. We don't know whether or not that's going to happen. Just to give you a sense of what a dramatic change this is in the 116th Congress compared to the last Congress, there were two major bills that the Republican-led House sent to us last year relating to guns. One was to legalize silencers. I remember when somebody first came to tell me about this and lobby me about it, I said, I didn't realize that the mafia had their own lobby in Washington. I mean, who's arguing for the legalization of silencers across the country? The bill even had a very clever name, which was it was something along the lines of the National Hearing Protection Act of 2017. The argument was that if we have silencers, then we're going to save gun owners from hearing loss. So, you know, I kid you not, I'm not making it up. The other bill that was brought forward to us had the misnomer of the National Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2018, which was a nice title, except it was the opposite of what the bill did. The purpose of the bill was to destroy reciprocity among the states in terms of concealed carry policies. We've already got the power to have concealed carry reciprocity between Maryland and Virginia or any other states. This would have wiped it out and said that if you can get a license to carry a concealed loaded weapon in any one state, then you could carry it in the whole country, regardless of what those states' laws were. So if you were denied the right to have a concealed carry loaded weapon in Maryland, you could go to Florida, which has the most permissive laws in the country, get one online. You don't even have to be a resident of Florida. You don't have to take any tests. You just need to fill out the form. I think 1.5 million people in Florida have concealed carry weapons and licenses to carry them. And they basically wanted to say, then if you could get it anywhere, then you've got a right to carry the weapon everywhere. So we obviously have two different philosophies out there, and you know, I'm hoping that after just the terrible violence that our people continue to endure every single day, that we can at the very least pass the universal background check legislation, pass the Violence Against Women Act, reauthorization with the gun provisions. We know that women in an abusive relationship are at least 4 times more likely to be killed by a gun than a woman who's not in an abusive relationship, and guns become a real flashpoint for violence in those kinds of abusive arrangements. So I don't know if do we have time for a few questions? Did you want to? We've got like 5 minutes. We've got time. If you've got any questions about what's going on in Congress, I'm happy to answer them. Yes.
Question on the red flag program is this gaining momentum nationally? I know it's a positive in the state of Maryland.
I think that it is. We've not yet had hearings on that, but I know that there's gathering momentum on it, and I know that in the Maryland General Assembly there is too. That legislation seems to make a lot of sense. It's remarkable to see the number of members of Congress that I serve with who represent communities which have been the scene of spectacular gun violence, like Congressman Deutsch who represents the Parkland community. Johanna Hayes represents the district in Newtown, Connecticut. But there have been so many of these episodes, as well as the daily brutal toll of people just dying in drive-by shootings and in other forms of homicides and suicides, of course. But there's a caucus that is formed of people who represent these communities. One piece of legislation that I introduced last year, I was so furious about the continuation of these moments of silence, which was basically what was happening. Something like the Las Vegas massacre would take place, 60 people dead, dozens of people wounded. It was like a scene from a military battle. And we would have a moment of silence, and they'd say, let's honor the people who died in Las Vegas yesterday. And then everybody would bow their heads for, I think I timed it at 7 seconds. And then we'd be off to renaming a post office someplace. So I introduced legislation saying that some of the members were saying they would no longer participate in a moment of silence because they saw it as just kind of a participating in a cover-up, of what was really going on. And I wrestled with that. I could see the logic of it, but also you don't you don't want to do anything that might dishonor or disrespect families going through mourning. So I went the other way. I said that under the rules of the House, there can be no moments of silence taken for victims of gun violence unless they last an entire 60 seconds. Got to be a whole minute. So we really, the people really think about it, and two, also see how much time that takes, because there's so many now that even a minute, becomes a real factor. But the Republicans didn't put it on the floor, so we never had a debate about that. Yeah.
Question, Boris Lucian, the Dean of the School of Public Health here. A few weeks ago, we had a roundtable. Your colleague, Congressman Sarbanes, had sponsored a get-together at Anne Arundel Medical Center to discuss issues dealing with guns as well. And the theory that sort of came up there is, if we portray this, and I want to see sort of your effectiveness of getting across the aisle, if you will. We portray this, that part of the discussion needs to deal with the gun safety issue. Does that somehow, from your perspective, lessen the partisanship that exists, or is that just viewed as a cover, if you will?
I think a little bit. I hope so. Certainly in Annapolis, I think that helped somewhat. Help us get to the Firearms Safety Act of 2013. Annapolis is a far less partisan place than Congress is. It's less polarized, less extreme. I mean, as tough as it can be sometimes. But I've got an ATF agent who's on leave and working on detail in my office for the year, and we have a project that we're definitely trying to push the idea of gun safety regulations and protocols governing what gun dealers do, because there are so many burglaries. People come in, break in, steal the gun supply, and then they go out. Now, some of them, there are bad apple gun dealers out there, of course, and some of them have been dealing directly into the criminal underworld too. But in any event, it would help a lot if we had very strict regulatory requirements for the safe storage of guns in gun stores, which are so often the targets of robberies.
Great. We have time for one more question out in the audience there. And from the students, anyone from the students' perspective? I have one faculty person, but a faculty gets bumped by a student. That's how we look at teach-ins like this. Anything from the students?
I can answer both if they both come.
Okay, yes. If there's a student who wants to do a question, in the meantime, Adele.
Hi, thank you.
Can you maybe go up to because we are online here, and we just want to make sure that our virtual audience hears these questions as well.
Okay. So thank you for being here. You may have seen that I think it was Everytown filed a complaint with the IRS to remove the NRA's tax-exempt status. So as a former law professor, what do you think about that?
Wait, was this based on campaign activities?
That and the excessive CEO compensation and compensation from other for-profit entities, insurance and ad firms. It just, I just saw it yesterday. So
that's interesting. Well, I've not seen that. I think that's very interesting. The abuse of 501c3 not-for-profit status is something that's generally of interest to people in Congress, and running not-for-profits for either explicitly partisan purposes or running them as make-believe not-for-profits when they're really making a lot of money and people are getting rich on it. That's something of real interest to me, so I'll definitely check that out.
Yeah, because I wonder if that's another activism. If you can't always go down the legislative road, there are many other opportunities. And I would just, as an aside, Senator Moynihan, I believe in the 80s, tried to have a bill that would limit the amount of ammunition a person could buy a year so that he could get away from the notion of gun purchase. So just something to think about.
I think that from a Second Amendment perspective, the courts will treat ammunition like firearms. Like if somebody says, well, let's just ban ammunition, I think that the answer would be that cuts into your ability to exercise your Second Amendment rights, assuming you've got them. Now, one of the things we're always trying to correct is that the Second Amendment doesn't give you an unlimited right to do whatever you want with guns or to get any kind of gun that you want, or for anybody to access a gun, even if they're a felon or a fugitive or a domestic offender and so on. But we're always trying to point out that the Supreme Court's decision in the Heller case took the position that the Second Amendment right is conditioned on reasonable regulation. But I will definitely follow up on what you're telling me about, and I think that that's interesting because there certainly have been not-for-profit groups that have gotten into trouble with the law when you get people making obscene salaries, millions of dollars, and so on. I don't know what the specifics are there, but I'll definitely look into it.
Congressman, evidence to try to think about for almost 5 years. What are the key questions that we need to ask?
Yes.
How do we answer them? Science.
Yes.
As a way to solve some of these issues.
Well, it's an excellent point. Thank you for raising it. Yes, and we've been doing whatever we can to try to overthrow the Dickey Amendment, the ban on scientific research into gun violence as a health epidemic. And again, the House is taking a strong stand on that. We're waiting to see if the Senate will do anything. It is part, generally, of this war on science. Nothing could be more antithetical to the attitudes of the founders of the country than the idea of we don't want to know. We don't want to know empirically what the evidence is. We don't want to know what works to counteract gun violence and what doesn't. I mean, that's a very radical posture that they've got, but it's the same posture they have on climate change, which is, well, we don't want to know, or we're in denial. We're just going to make stuff up to try to destroy science whose social implications we don't like, and this is the same thing. There's a good book that I read called Gunfight by Adam Winkler, who's a professor out in California, and he makes the point that there was a moment in time when the National Rifle Association was really a middle-of-the-road, reasonable organization that supported gun safety regulation and wanted to make it safe, and they saw it as in their interest not to have a bloody gun violence culture in America. And then it basically got taken over by politicians in the 1970s who took the tack that, hey, we can use the gun issue as a political wedge between people who live in metropolitan areas and people who live in rural areas, and we can use it as a political bludgeon. And so in order to accomplish that, they've got to take the position that we oppose any kind of gun safety regulation at all, because inevitably it puts us on the road to total confiscation of guns, which of course is ridiculous because of the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court. But it has created this kind of simplistic bipolar thinking, like it's, either you're for the Second Amendment or you're for gun safety, and that's not right. I mean, we can support people's Second Amendment rights for recreation, for self-defense, everything that the majority talked about in the Heller case, at the same time that we dramatically make policy advances in making the society safer. And it's just sad that they have this anti-scientific know-nothing bent now in terms of approaching the debate.
Great.
Oh. There was one more hand, but I don't know.
The agenda here, I see as more business-oriented, that the business lobbies, the industry is looked behind some of this we don't want to know. And I guess I'm just worried. I feel that this administration right now is so pro-business. I'm concerned about what approaches, and that's why I'm here. I'm interested in what can we do in the public health world to address the powerful business lobby.
Well, I think you're right, and again, I'll go back to the analogy with climate change. There are clearly major industrial forces that don't want people to believe in climate change and don't want us to act responsibly to try to address climate change. And I think it's the same thing in the field of gun violence. There are important industry forces that want to maintain, and basically an unlimited trade in firearms, and also benefit, like profit directly from periodic scares that everybody's guns are going to be confiscated. And that's deeply irresponsible for them to be in that mode. But I think that you're right. I'm hoping that this conference will produce some answers on that, on what we should do about it. But that's why I just come back to the Constitution, that people do have these basic rights, but we can make our society so much safer, even while respecting and honoring the Second Amendment rights, which are obviously a deep part of American popular and constitutional culture. I mean, even with that, we are going to have much higher rates of gun violence than other countries, but it doesn't have to be so obscene that it's, like we're living on battlefields just to go outside in certain communities. It just makes no sense. So anyway, I want to salute all of you for coming and participating, all the great activists who are here. Jen, Andrea, Eric, I know a bunch of people here. Thank you for the work that you're doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you for taking your time out. And I'm going to start off, first of all, by introducing our panelists here. And we're going to ask the panelists to provide some background, provide some information for us to stimulate discussion. Each panelist will have roughly 4 to 5 minutes. Rachel here is our timekeeper, so she'll be in charge of that aspect. I do, however, want to remind you that the term teach-in, right? We're using the term teach-in. Does anybody know when the term was coined? The concept of teaching? Give me an era.
1960s?
Yeah, 65, right? So the concept of teaching, and those of you who are old enough, remember that the 60s were a tumultuous time period, and certainly a tumultuous time period on college campuses. And in fact, if you look at Webster, right, the definition of teach-in, it's an extended meeting. One can say, okay, 4:15 to 6 o'clock, is that extended? It's beyond the usual lecture time, right, students? An extended meeting usually held on a college campus for lectures, debates, discussion, to raise awareness of or express a position on a social or political issue. So when you look at what's going on today, in essence, in a truncated fashion, the lectures, we're going to hear from panelists. We heard a little bit about the data. But really, we're here to do what? To make sure that we are raising awareness, expressing positions. Certainly, the rules of the day are the same. We may have divergent opinions and divergent expressions of that opinion. One is respect in this room, right? We're here at an educational institution where we listen as well as speak. So let's hear what people think. On our panel, you'll see the list of panelists up here. Erricka Bridgeford, co-founder and co-organizer of Baltimore Ceasefire 365, Bullock, Capital Region Violence Intervention Program. Andrea Chamblee is an FDA attorney and the widow of John McNamara, who was killed in the Capitol Gazette shootings. Our condolences to you. Kyle Ann Hunter is not here today. She would have been representing the Brady campaign and Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. She has been called for reservist duty. Jabari Lyles, LGBTQ Affairs Liaison from the Baltimore City Mayor's Office. Chief David Mitchell from the University of Maryland College Park Police Department. Jen Pauliukonis, President, Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, and Joseph Richardson, Department of African American Studies here at the university. I know that Chief David Mitchell has a obligation and will have to leave at 5:30, so we'll actually do it in this order. We'll begin with the chief and move in that direction. And roughly 4 to 5 minutes, and let's hear from you. And part of the tasking is share with us what you feel, what you think, but also at the end, Woody will take over and begin a process of that discussion. The concept of a teach-in, don't forget, is to take that social, political issue and be able to start discussing. Thank you so much for being here. Chief, you're on.
Thank you, Dean. Well, I feel blessed to be here with so many great members of a great panel and a great audience, where we come together to talk about an epidemic that I'm very familiar with. I've been a police officer for 48 years. I've seen a lot of gun violence. I've had a number of my colleagues murdered over the years. You may see I'm wearing a ribbon on my badge now for Kyle Owens, who was shot in the face 15 years ago on a traffic stop in Montgomery County. I remember when he was shot, and he just passed away as a result of being shot 15 years ago after being confined to a wheelchair for 15 years. And we wear that until he's laid to rest. But I've been touched more than my experience in gun violence against my colleagues. It's what has transpired against my community. I started in Prince George's County. I served there for 24 years, and I saw a lot of gun violence over the years. Then going to the Maryland State Police as superintendent for 8 years, and I helped Governor Glendening pass a number of gun bills in Annapolis, 1 gun a month and so forth. I worked very closely with Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who was our lieutenant governor, of course, the oldest child of Robert Kennedy, and she is intimately familiar, as you know from history, with gun violence. I also worked closely with Jim and Sarah Brady, both dear friends. Jim Brady shot during the attempted assassination of President Reagan, and his wife Sarah, who actually developed the Brady Center to prevent gun violence. I worked hard lobbying for the passage of the Brady bill. Was blessed to be in the White House when President Clinton signed it. This is the kind of common sense legislation that makes sense. Some of the saddest moments of my career: losing Len Bias, one of our greatest basketball players, but as tragic as that was, breaking the news to Mr. and Mrs. Bias that their other son, Jay, had been shot to death not far from here over jealousy. He happened to be in a jewelry store and made a purchase, and a boyfriend saw him talking with the clerk and shot him to death because of that. This is senseless violence. How many young lives have we lost because of short tempers and big guns? You know, that starts long before, and I'm sure our panel's going to talk about it, it starts long before somebody has access to a gun. It starts in many of our communities and our families. It starts with cries for help that get ignored, opportunities to improve a lot of our cities and communities that don't get the help they need. So I'm excited. You know, if 97% of the population in the United States supports common sense gun legislation, let's band together. Let's demand that it happens. And I'm here to do my part. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erricka Bridgeford, co-founder and co-organizer of Baltimore Ceasefire 365. So what I feel and what I think. So I feel really tired of this conversation. It is crazy. I believe that the only reason, one of the main reasons we're still in discussion mode about this is because enough white people aren't being killed. And I'm just going to start there. I'm happy to hear this being called an epidemic in this space. In a lot of places, it's not called an epidemic. It's very much like the drug epidemic when it was only impacting black and brown people. It was they're just trifling and they don't want help. And then when white people started dying from drug overdoses, then suddenly it was an epidemic. And I'm telling you right now, they're going to have to bleep out every interview I have when more white people get killed through gun violence and it gets called an epidemic in more public and media spaces. Yeah, you can clap for that. And so the one reason I'm exhausted at it still being in discussion mode is because there is enough data to show what the root causes of violence are. There is enough, you're in an educational institution where I'm sure you've learned a lot of the data about what causes violence. Even when people are thinking about, well, what are the solutions? We know that locking people up makes people more susceptible to be violent. So it's very clear that that's a route we keep taking, and it's a route that keeps getting people killed. But yet it's the root, because people are looking for knee-jerk reactions instead of heart-jerk reactions, they go to what does it look like is going to resolve it right now. And so we know that mandatory minimums, for instance, if you look in Baltimore, from having mandatory minimums, the generation now that is susceptible to being violent and impacted by violence as victims are the children of people who were going to prison because of mandatory minimums. And so if you understand adverse childhood experiences, you know that having someone in your house incarcerated now makes you more likely to be violent. So I'm exhausted that we're still talking about it when we should be doing more things about it. My quick answer to what you should be doing is stop using that question as a cop-out. Your heart has told you a lot of things to do to help whatever little world you are in, but you rationalize those things away. Oh, that's too crazy. Oh, I can't do it. Oh, nobody will do it with me. Nobody doesn't have to do it with you. Be that lone person on a mountaintop by yourself, screaming a message and doing the work.
She said how I was feeling. So my name is Bullock. In 2013, I was stabbed 13 times at a local nightclub in the Washington, D.C. area. I was medevac to Prince George's County Hospital right here in Chamblee. Once I was at the hospital, my lung had collapsed. I really couldn't feel anything with my legs and my feet and things of that nature. I was stabbed because of a rival beef with a neighborhood that we've had a lot of interactions with when it comes to violence. I've been on both sides. I've been in front of a gun, I've been behind a gun. August 3rd, I think that caught up with me. I remember the knife going into my chest. I remember going into my shoulders. At that particular time, I thought I was dead. I walked out the club and passed out. I remember the EMS worker putting me on the stretcher and medevacing or taking me to the helicopter. At that particular time, I passed out. Waking up in a hospital with 13 holes in you and bleeding, that's one of the most terrifying experiences that I've ever had. But sometimes you got to look at the blessing within the burden.
Come on.
Dr. Richardson, to the right of me, was doing a study on men that's been violently injured. I was released from the hospital, and Dr. Richardson and Dr. St. Ville from SUNY Buffalo called my home. I wasn't there. They left a message with my aunt. So I called Dr. Richardson and Dr. St. Ville back, and the first thing they said is, "How you feeling?" That was foreign to me. My first thought was, they're the police, and I don't want to have anything to do with them. So somehow, Dr. Richardson and Dr. St. Ville allowed me or got me to come back up to Prince George's County Hospital to participate in the study. I walk into the room, small room with a little table, and one of the first things that they did was pull out a tape recorder. Okay. They might be the police. But I was foreign to any type of studies. And the first question that they asked me is, what do you want to do with your life? At that age, I was 24, 25 years old. I had no answer. Growing up in the urban community, I focused on the financial capital of life. So let me break it down for you guys. It's something called the 3 C's: social capital, financial capital, and human capital. Human capital, developing your mind. Social capital, it's all about your network. And financial capital is always about money. So when they broke that down to me, it made sense. So Dr. Richardson said, hey, so Mr. Bullock, I want you to come speak to my class at the University of Maryland. So I go from being in the streets to being stabbed, to being medevac, to being in PG Hospital, to being asked to guest lecture a college class. By this time, excuse my French, but I was scared shitless. So I walk into the class, and it's maybe about 110, 115 students. I've never did any type of lecturing before. And when I stood up on that stage, I told my truth. I talked to the students about watching my brother die, watching 2 of my best friends getting killed in front of me, watching my cousin die in my arms while I tried to perform CPR. And at that moment, talking to them students was very infectious. At that time, I knew this is my calling. So to fast forward, 2 to 3 years later, Dr. Richardson says, hey, well, I'm coming up with a program called the Capital Region Violence Intervention Program, and I want you to be a credible messenger. I'm like, a credible messenger? And when he explained to me what a credible messenger is, you'll be the first point of contact to walk into a room for resources to bridge the gaps between social services and the urban community. So over the past 2 to 3 years, that's what I did. I walked into these rooms, and I seen myself. I remember going into the room 808. I worked at the 8th floor is where they keep all violent injuries. I walk into that room 808 every time, and I see myself. But one of the first questions I asked the gentleman, what do you want to do with your life? And they have no idea. Only thing they can say is, I got to provide for my family. 3 years later, I have my own business. I've been on the Kojo Nnamdi show. I've been all across this country telling my story, but it took someone to believe in me, right? Greatness is not this esoteric type life form. Greatness is within all of us. We just got to tap into it. But coming from where I come from, we're not told that. We are what we see. I don't want to talk you guys' head off too much. That was just something brief. I usually have maybe about 90 minutes to discuss the whole story, but I tried to have it within 3.
Good afternoon. I am Professor Joseph Richardson, a professor here in the Department of African American Studies and Anthropology, as well as a professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Maryland School of Med. First, I'd like to thank the Dean for inviting me, as well as Professor Kessel and Aaron for coordinating this. I think it's a much-needed venue for us to talk, but I agree totally with Ms. Bridgeford's statements. So what has not been explained, briefly explained by Che, is I'm the co-founder and program and research director for the Capital Region Violence Program at the University of Maryland, Prince George's Hospital Center, Capital Region Health. Kind of make sure I'd say that last part. It's pretty long-winded. But the reason why I think it's so important for at least scholars to be engaged in this conversation, and particularly for myself personally, is that one of the statistics that was presented regarding gun violence is African American men, particularly between the ages of 20 and 24, have the highest homicide rate in the country, and that's been persistent for decades. And personally, I was just tired of seeing young men that look like me dying, whether it's in my community, where I know plenty of people who are my age and much older who have died as victims of gunshot wounds in Philadelphia or here in the DC metropolitan area. And so in 2013, I started a study in the trauma unit at Prince George's Hospital where I recruited 25 young men who had been violently injured and followed them for a period of 2 years. And Che was part of that study. That study was ultimately used to inform, in my relationship to him to a certain extent, really framed the intervention. Because what Dr. Saintville, who was my postdoc at the time, saw, and he was also trained as a social worker, is that we really needed a program that was, A, culturally competent and understood the population that we were working with, and that was sincere about the guys and the relationships that we built. Many times I will see that the relationships between patients that come in with gunshot wounds and physicians that work with them often deal with them in a treat and street fashion, where the relationship is just transactional. You patch them up, you send them back out to the street. So the National Network of Hospital Violence Intervention Programs thought we need to have a different approach, and there are 34, at that time, there were 34 programs. This program ended up being the 35th. But just to give you some idea about why we do it, is one of the reasons is to reduce the rate of trauma recidivism. When we started our program, when I had the study, the trauma recidivism rate was 32%. 1 out of every 3 people we approached at bedside, they had been there before. We started in August 2017. We've had 116 people that we've treated in our program. And Che is, as much of the success of it is due to Che as well as, some of our other staff, but I would say wholeheartedly, Che is responsible for much of that for his relationship. As of this year, we had 1 person return. We have a trauma recidivism rate of less than 1% in a matter of 17 months. So we can quantify, yes, we reduced the trauma recidivism rate by 31%, but we can't quantify how many people did we save from killing someone else. Because many of the guys that come in are both on one end of that barrel and on the other end on that trigger. And that's what we can't quantify. And so the important thing is for us is that we stay engaged, and as scholars, we use more of a translational science approach, because far too often we have so much data, but we're doing absolutely nothing with it. And the onus is on us to translate that into something more applied to address the problems that we know we can address and are solvable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. I know it's a beautiful day outside. My name is Andrea Chamblee, and until about 10 months ago, I was a pretty nondescript public servant working for FDA, teaching part-time at George Washington, and complaining about not having spare time to be active in the causes that I cared about. And then on June 28th, with the shooting at the Annapolis Capitol, my husband, John McNamara, was killed, and my life and my identity turned upside down. I mean, you saw the staggering numbers of gun violence, and it keeps reminding me that I'm not up there. I wasn't killed. I'm not injured. I don't have any physical manifestations unless you count getting about 3 hours sleep a night. But I'm still a casualty of the status quo of gun violence in this country. And probably a lot of you are too. I know a lot of you are students, but you don't have to be married to be worried about domestic violence. You probably have been in a classroom since Columbine and maybe even participated in a lockdown drill somewhere. You've probably heard about run, hide, and fight. And maybe even when you walk into a room, you double check about where all the exits are before you get really settled in. this is pretty new. This is the first generation of people who have to put up with this crap. And I hope you don't put up with it anymore. And the purpose of this teach-in is to help you guys be active too. And I had student loans for a long time. I wrote measly checks to Mayors Against Illegal Guns once in a while. And I wasn't very active. And now I'm sort of thrown into it myself. And I mean, I guess the good news is there's roles for everybody in this fight. It became apparent to me when the press kind of scrambled to talk to me and stuck the microphone right past the black mom whose son died 15 years ago, who's still out there struggling to make sense of her loss. And all the moms who send their kids out every day and wonder if they're going to come back, and the ones in Baltimore and all over Maryland and everywhere whose worst fears come true. For me, I've sort of decided my role is to make people watch me. I've granted every interview I could. I've developed quite a following on Facebook, which I call Twitter for old people. I finished my husband's book, and I'm trying to keep that in the limelight. He went to Maryland, and he covered Maryland sports for about 35 years, and I just got his cover designed last week, and it's out there. So I can't speak for those moms that lost their kids and the people who've been wounded and on gurneys in hospitals. But if I can make more people relate to me and start questioning themselves on their confidence that this won't happen to them so they don't have to worry about it, I guess that's my role. And I hope you guys will find a role that you can too. And I know it's kind of tempting to just click on a petition online. And that's fine. The organization will have your email, and they'll be asking you to do something else after that. But I hope you find something else to do, because I think this is the civil rights issue of our time. It affects women, it affects people of color, it affects the LGBT community, it affects people who are terrorized and threatened without ever getting shot. A lot of people tell me that these extreme risk protection laws and these background checks wouldn't have saved my husband. And mass shootings get a lot of play because they tend to affect people who didn't expect it. I mean, my husband was in his cubicle at work one day. People who are in a yoga studio, people who are watching a movie. They get a lot of attention, and they should, but they're not the only victims of this. It's the civil rights issue of our time. And the people who tell me that law or whatever that I'm striving for close the background check loophole wouldn't save my husband, I have to tell them, that decision has been made. You had a chance to save my husband and close loopholes and pass better laws, and you didn't do it. And now the idea is to help everybody that we can. This is 100% preventable death. 100% preventable. Like when the baby reaches into a diaper bag and finds a loaded gun, when an officer gets shot by the side of the road and ends up in a wheelchair for 15 years, all this is preventable. So I hope you'll find what you can do and show up for that one thing. If you can go to Annapolis for one day next session and sit there with a red shirt on, it doesn't even have to have this on it. Sit there with a red shirt on so they see you. Call your congressman. There's a gun violence action network that you can join. There's something called 5 calls. They will email you every day with 5 telephone numbers you can call to just be present and make sure your legislators know that you're paying attention. You don't have to turn your life upside down, I hope, like what's happened to me. I'll never forget one person came up to me and said, "Oh, at least your life has purpose now."
Ooh.
Woo, ooh. And I said, you don't have to wait for this to happen to you to make this your purpose. It doesn't have to be a full-time purpose like these guys devoted their careers now to preventing this from happening again. And I still have a job. But it doesn't have to be your purpose 24/7, but make it your purpose for 10 minutes a day or one day a year, and you can really make a difference. And I didn't pay attention to the timer, so I don't know how much time I have left, but I'll stop there. Oh, you can text. You can text student to 64433. Even if you're not a student, go ahead. To 64433, and they'll help you with ideas for how you can incorporate activism in your regular life. And if you're an educator, you can text educator to the same number, 64433. Sorry, this kind of it's still raw. I don't know if it's ever going to not get raw. But anyway, welcome to the fight.
Thanks so much, and what a powerful panel. Thanks everyone for sharing yourselves. So my name is Jabari Lyles, and I think when I first heard word of this event, I thought, well, what do I have to do with gun violence? And I thought, well, of course, the LGBT community has suffered so many different types of violence, and gun violence is, of course, one of them. So I'm happy to provide that spin on the conversation. It's so cool that that spin is included. The LGBT community is very cross-cutting of a lot of different social identities. So you can be any race, any gender, any class, and still have different sexual orientations. So what I do right now, I work in the mayor's office, and I support and advise the city government on the needs and experiences of the LGBT community, but also working to increase the community's visibility and capacity. My background before coming to the mayor's office was in nonprofits and teaching. So I'm a former elementary and middle school teacher. That was my first love. It's always my favorite job. And before that, and after that as well, I was the executive director of a couple of nonprofits, one to work on LGBT issues in K-12 education, and another one just being the general LGBT community center of Baltimore City. And so much of my work has been teaching people to love each other, teaching people to love themselves, teaching people to love difference, teaching people not to be scared of difference. And I do that in my work as a teacher, and I do that in my work as an advisor to the government. And so when I think about gun violence from a public health perspective, when I think of public health, I think about, health, prevention, access, care, treatment. And what that sounds like to me is education. So many people that I come across every single day don't even have an opportunity to discuss the beauties of being different, the importance of diversity, the importance of loving your neighbor. So whether or not I'm doing an LGBT 101 and explaining what pansexual means, or sitting with kids who are trying to make their schools better for LGBT people, I'm mostly concerned about how we create and build a society that loves each other. And being LGBTQ, particularly being out, takes a lot of courage, and it's tough. And I don't have to talk about, the increased levels of suicidal ideation and, of course, the violence against Black trans women that happens in our country for you to understand how gun violence touches our community. And so for me, my perspective is, how do we take opportunities to get to the hearts and minds of people? And how does that translate into a better world? And as a government employee, how are our policies and our systems predisposing people to violence? How are we perpetuating systems of oppression that lend themselves to violence. And so, those are some of my primary concerns. I remember teaching preschool, which was a great job, by the way. Lots of free apple juice. And you would hear on the playground, boys don't do this, girls don't do this. And so I've been working for LGBT issues in K-12 schools for about 15 years, and a lot of folks don't think that young people are ready to talk about this topic. They don't think that they're ready to talk about what your gender is and what your gender expression is and your sexual orientation. And, my charge or my hope is that we start to talk about diversity and difference at younger ages. People graduate high school not knowing who they are, much less the people they're going to work with and go to college with. So, as an educator, I always look to the power of teaching and learning. I mean, we're doing a teaching right now of how that can change behaviors and actions. And that does take hope. Sometimes I'm often deflated to say, oh, you can't professional development away gun violence. Right. And I do hold out hope for the capacity for all people to love and all people to change. And if we look to our young folks, particularly as a resident of Baltimore City, I believe the way to heal that city is to heal our young people. And how we heal our young people is largely their experiences in school. So that's where I come from. It's my life's work, and I'm just happy to be here with you all today. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Pauliukonis. I'm the president of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence. I got involved in this work in December of 2012, like so many people, because of the shooting at Sandy Hook School. I was a mother, former teacher. I was staying home with my kids, 1.5 and 3 at the time. And I realized that I was complicit. I was complicit because I was in college when Columbine happened, and I did nothing. I assumed that our leaders would take care of this. I remember when the Virginia Tech shooting happened. I remember when the Aurora shooting happened, and I did nothing. And then I realized that I was complicit in even more of that because I live just outside of Baltimore, and there were gun deaths and injuries in Baltimore, and I had also not done anything. And I was complicit as a white person in this country who made rationalizations for deaths and homicides of people of color. And so I realized that I needed to step forward and be better. We all need to be better. So I started volunteering, I started educating myself, and where I started educating myself was the world of public health, getting to understand this disease better. And I started learning some of the facts that Dr. Kessel spoke about. Over almost 40,000 people die every year in this country. Over 130,000 are injured in this country. In Maryland alone, almost 800 people die by a gun. 271 of those are gun suicides, and most of the rest are gun homicides. And of course, those are concentrated in areas like Baltimore City and Prince George's County, and the rural areas of gun suicides all across the state. But we don't talk about these areas in terms of policy work and that gets national coverage like we do in terms of the Auroras and the Capital Gazettes and the Sandy Hooks. We don't talk about East Baltimore. We don't talk about Park Heights or Santan Winchester. And so as we educate ourselves in public health, I think it's also really important to understand the realities of what's going on the ground. If we talk about school shootings, it's different in an area like Parkland as it is in Baltimore City. Just this winter, I was at Matthew A. Henson Elementary School in West Baltimore, and the school went on lockdown. And this lockdown was because of the violence in the community, not because of violence in the school. And I think it's important that we understand this distinction. There had been a father who had dropped off his twins at the elementary school and was shot and killed on his way home. And I want to make sure that we understand that not only is this preventable, not only do we know these solutions, that if a gun is in the situation in a home, you're 2 times more likely to die of a homicide. You're 3 times more likely to die of a suicide. If it's in a domestic violence situation, a woman is 5 times more likely to die with a gun. But also, while nothing is happening in D.C., and we're still all working on making sure that we can change Congress, that we can change these laws, and while I know so many of the students are focused on D.C., there are so many things that we need to be doing on the state level. And if I can leave everyone here with one of the most important things is that we can change the country by changing our state laws. And we've been very successful in being able to do that over the past few years. There's still obviously a lot of work that we need to do. But I want to make sure very, very quickly that we talk about the successes that we've had. A funding bill to fund the violence and intervention programs across the state, these community programs. Handgun purchaser licensing. Making sure that we have extreme risk laws to remove guns from those who are showing warning signs. And also, this session, we were able to pass a law to require the governor's office to do a trace study on illegal guns to find out where are these guns coming from and how can we stop them from getting on our streets. Yes. So progress is happening, but we need your voices, as Andrea said, in Annapolis. We need to understand that when we all come together, we can make great change. And so I thank you guys all for being here.
You know, on the one hand, we're moved by all of your stories and all of your thoughtfulness in every one of the actions that indeed you've described. But I think the most powerful thing collectively is I'm proud to be associated with all of you and all of what you're doing, and that there's optimism and hope here, that we can change some things. We can change those horrible data. And Chief, I know that you indeed have to leave, and we thank you for protecting us, taking care of us, and keeping us safe in all of this. And, you know, each and every one of you has just had an incredible story and narrative. And we ended with Jen talking about activism and talking about what we can do in all of this, and that it's going to take some time and tenacity and fortitude, and we can bear with it. And the other point that Andrea made about it really touches all of us. It isn't just those data on that slide. It's every time you listen to a news article, to listen to a neighbor's story, the consequences and the concerns are extraordinary. Well, we have some time to certainly engage thoughts, comments, questions. I want to acknowledge Dr. Askew. George Askew is a fellow pediatrician and now taking over an important role in Prince George's County, and we appreciate all of George's experience and leadership, and thank you for joining us, George, and we look forward to you becoming reconnected and part of this family again. And the only other thing I want to say is this is one of the few times I'm not the oldest in the room. So the Ridgewood folks, yes. Ryder.
I'd like to explain who we are. Who is this group of people that are saying? My name is Annette Groundart, and I am the head of the gun control group at Bridgeford. But we started over a year ago when one day I was sitting eating dinner at we are a senior citizen group of over 2,500 people, sitting and having dinner and saying, this was right after Parkland. Why are we just sitting here? What did we do? So we got a bunch of people together, and with that, Generation to Generation was born. Generation to Generation means grandparents and children joining hands together to do something about the problems with gun violence. We organized two events. One was reading the names of the people that were killed in each one of the venues and their ages. The other one was having a march. It was the largest march that Riderwood ever had. We organized people to make signs, and we asked children to come from different high schools to speak, clergy to come and speak, and it was a fantastic event. Supposedly, it was supposed to be great until the CEO, who was very aware of what we were doing, said we couldn't go ahead with what we were doing. And the night before our march, he said, "You can't march. I won't allow it." So we had a meeting, and we asked him to come to the meeting. And I said to him, he said, there are people that belong to the NRA here, and there are people here that have guns, and they are opposed to what you are doing. I said, well, they can go out and do what they want to, but we're going to do this. He said, no, you're not. I said, then you're going to have to arrest me. And he said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with you. I said, well, you're going to let us march. And we had a fantastic march. Thank you. However, now we are a group of very, very dedicated people who are trying to do something to show awareness of what is going on with gun control. And we are looking for answers, concrete answers of what we can do so that people can understand that this is a health problem. This is not a Democratic problem. This is not a Republican problem. This is a health problem. And we're looking for answers, and that's why we're here today. And thank you for letting us come.
Other comments? Yes. There's a microphone. We can pass it around. Some of it, and I can get mine.
My name is Tamia Webster. I work here at the university in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I hate that the chief is walking out because the question around gun violence that I know that a lot of young activists, and I think people, I don't want to just give credit to young activists, but they've been coming to me asking questions around gun violence and why isn't the conversation around police shootings involved in gun violence? I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska, and I did a lot of work with Black and Indigenous communities there. And in my community in Alaska, people don't think, but gun violence is a huge deal. And what we saw a lot in Alaska is that because Native Alaskans had jurisdiction over their communities, that police officers would go in and there would be all kinds of shootings that happen, and it would be a form of gun violence. And so I guess I'm wondering, why isn't that a conversation that we're having in the midst of this conversation?
I can speak for myself. When I talk about gun violence, I'm talking about people. I don't care if you have on a uniform or not, right? And so, my problem with there being more focus on conversations about police shootings is, you heard earlier, there's this thing that happens even in activism spaces where if your child was killed by a police officer, you somehow get more celebrity, your death is more important, your grief is more important, there's a big rally, there are marches in the street. But my mom still is not going to see her son anymore either. I'm never going to see my brother again either. And so the pain is not more important when it happens with the police shooting. And so for me, I'm purposely talking about everybody. And I'm not going to, just like I'm not uplifting whether it was a drug-related shooting or whether it was a domestic violence shooting or whether it was just somebody was angry and didn't know how to handle conflict or it was a police involved or a police officer shot somebody. I'm talking about everybody needs to learn how to keep their hands to themselves and not use guns irresponsibly. Everybody. So I'm answering your question from my standpoint. I am talking about police violence as with the rest of the gun violence.
I think that's absolutely important, but for me, the conversation does not happen at that level, because I agree with you but police officers have a certain kind of power, and the shootings that happen, the violence that happens at the hands of police officers is just not talked about at all. And it's not even brought up in this setting, in this conversation, as a form of violence. And so, yes, you may be putting this in a bubble of all-encompassing, and I agree with you. Like, violence is violence to me. But I'm wondering why that conversation is not happening at a larger level.
I disagree that it's not happening at a larger level, and it might just be because I'm in these conversations all the time. But police shootings, like there's so much activism around police-involved shootings that what actually happens is that community-involved shootings get ignored, and police-involved shootings are actually the ones that get more conversation, more funding, more resources, more attention than when it happens in community. Not well in the activism spaces, yes, because it's about holding police officers accountable. There's a whole consent decree in Baltimore because of what happened to Freddie Gray, right? And so police violence is something that gets immediate uprising from everybody, whereas you can die in the community every single day.
I would say from a research standpoint, why it's not discussed is primarily it's a policy issue. So only 3 to 4% of law enforcement agencies report their shootings. So how many people are shot by the police and live? So the Washington Post, The Guardian, they've done really good independent analysis of how many people are killed by the police every year. But how many people are shot by the police every year and survive, we know nothing about. That's a black hole. And I'll just give you an example. So I published a paper called Who Shot Ya? And how emergency departments could collect reliable police shooting data. And the reason why I published that paper was based on my research at Prince George's, and part of our exclusion criteria for doing gun violence research is that we cannot interview anyone that's under police custody. So that person that's lying in that bed, in that room under custody, who could potentially have been shot by the police, as a researcher, that we're barred from interviewing that person. So we'll never get the true context of what happened. The only person that could, the medical staff at the hospital can make that determination. But then that has to actually be checked off on the ICD-10, right? So you can code for it. Initially, when I was doing my study at Prince George's, you couldn't code for that on the ICD-9, like injury by legal intervention. But part of that is that we just don't collect good data on how many people are actually shot by the police every year and live. We don't know that number. That number just remains in the black hole. So we really need to change the policies to make police reportings of all shootings mandatory.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
think that
didn't answer your
gets
question.
I think that gets to the greater problem of our terrible patchwork collection of information on gun violence and gun injuries and deaths. And as another example, one of the legislators who didn't want to close the background check loophole emailed me and said he was on the side of injured children, and he was going to propose a bill to arm teachers in schools. So there's no evidence that says arming teachers in schools makes schools any safer. You sell a lot more guns that way, but you don't make the students safer. And there's a project called After Parkland that tells the stories of children since Valentine's Day last year at Parkland, of all the children who died since then because of gun violence. And I pointed the legislator to this list, and you can sort by state. So there's 31 kids at the time we talked who had been killed by guns since Parkland. All but one of them were killed outside of school. All of them were killed because somebody who shouldn't have had a gun had one, and it was in their home, or their friends got a hold of it. So it's the underlying problem seems to be easy access to guns, no matter where you get killed and how you get killed and how old you are when you get killed. And I've certainly heard officers complain that they never know who's armed anymore, and that gives them a ready excuse for when there's a police-involved shooting. And sometimes they're right, that the other person had a gun, and sometimes they're not, and sometimes the person had a gun and didn't do anything with it, like the gentleman whose name escapes me, who was shot in his car with his girlfriend next to him.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a legal gun owner. So because we're inundated with guns in so many places that are often in the wrong hands, the problem is just exacerbated on every level in every neighborhood, and we don't have good data about it because of the restrictions on collecting data. And that, if we want research-based solutions, we need to change that whole platform for collecting data on this.
Anybody else?
I'm not going to say anything remarkable. I just think that to answer your question, why are police-involved shootings not included in these types of forums? Even though I do believe that police-involved shootings, there's a lot of activism and conversations happening around that, but they're called police-involved shootings, right? They're not called this.
Right.
And I think the reason is the same reason that these officers aren't held accountable, right, is because when we talk about the actions of police, that's often a constipating issue that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And if we don't address the racism that happens in how police conduct themselves, we'll never have a real answer. And I think that's intentional why these two conversations repel each other.
You know, thank you for raising that. At the bottom of the first slide, when we were showing the magnitude of this nightmare, there's this category called legal intervention.
Isn't that called homicide?
And it's fascinating to me, the word legal and intervention and how we count that. But I was sort of amazed that that was in there, and that's part of the small number of, frankly, again, in public health, we changed accident to injury, because accident implied a passive, we couldn't do anything about it, we had no control over it, it was something else that was responsible. So we changed it to injury to enable us to then think about how that might be prevented. And that's a small category too. And you bring up another incredibly important point for us as a community to think about collectively. One of the most complex things in my career is how many times I've heard the word first, worst, biggest. We all get caught up in, for me, one is too many. And then there's multiple dimensions to this. We have two police officers from campus police with us in the back, and their perspective is safety. And so trying to figure out how to get the kind of data that Joe is talking about and Erricka is talking about so we can appreciate and understand what happened in that circumstance versus, frankly, one of the limits in public health is we operate on average. We operate in general. And we need to know in specific what happened here and why are our people protecting our safety working and others not. And Joe brings up some of those issues about training and racism and other kinds of dynamics in this. Other comments, questions?
Actually,
yes,
can I follow up with that?
Jen, I'm sorry.
I also think that brings an important point about the idea of legal intervention or defensive gun use. Because one of the biggest myths that we're still facing is the fact that guns make us safer. And we know that's not true. And as more states have created right-to-carry laws or concealed carry laws or loosened their concealed carry requirements, there's actually a study by John Donahue that's shown that violent crime has gone up. You see an escalation on interpersonal gun violence. You see more people who have guns in their cars are stolen and, of course, diverted to the underground market. And then when you have states like in Florida with very loose concealed carry laws combined with stand your ground laws, you can find, of course, something's going to be an illegal intervention law when all you have to say is that you feel unsafe. You are armed, you feel unsafe. And obviously we know how once combined with racism and biases, you get the murders of Trayvon Martin. So I think when we're also talking about intervention, it's important to also talk about more guns in the hands of more people is going to make us less safe.
Sure. That'll be even easier. If you all go to the microphone, then I won't be held responsible for picking the wrong folks. And we've got a mic over here, too, that you don't even have to go to the microphone. We can pass it around if you want to raise your hand.
I wanted to know what your guys' perspective is on the role of journalists in this movement to prevent gun violence and how they should, if you believe they should work to, like, equally represent gun violence in different communities, especially communities of color. How should they go about this?
You're looking at me, so I'm going to go ahead and... I have a very mixed relationship with the media. So when we began Baltimore Ceasefire 365, we wanted everybody in the city to know. So we went to media to say, hey, can you just report that this weekend is going to happen? And everybody from NPR to local news said it's not news. We'll report on it the day after the ceasefire to see how it went. And what ended up happening was so many people did outreach and put ceasefire posters all over the city that they had to recognize it as news because they were trying to figure out, why am I seeing ceasefire posters everywhere I go? And so they ended up being a big way that the message and the weekends, they look at the calendar, they come to all the events. It becomes a really big thing that people find out about because of the media, right? And at the same time, the way that the media reports about homicide, the imagery, so imagery really matters, right? The way the brain is designed. There was a study that showed they would flash 20 pictures really quickly at people. And they would ask, did you see a shoe and a hat? And people would say no. Then they would flash those same 20 pictures, except they would replace the hat and the shoe with a spider and a snake. And they would ask, they would flash the pictures and go, did you see a spider and a snake? Of course, people saw the spider and the snake. The difference is because the way our brains are designed, we purposely hold on to pictures of things that we think are detrimental and dangerous to our survival as a species. And so if you constantly see images of black people being violent, being killed, you order, all of us, not just white people, but black people, we now just images in our head, we will uphold the image of a white man in a suit and tie, but a black boy in a white t-shirt and sagging jeans we think is dangerous, when in reality, white men in suit and ties kill more people every day than black boys could ever kill, right? But it's imagery that does that. And so the media is a huge way that this imagery is pushed out, people's individual stories of who they are and who love them and what they did every day with their lives. That's not a story that's told. And even recently with this whole thing with Mayor Pugh, right? So everything is happening with that. And then we notice we're in day 10 and nobody has been killed in Baltimore. Right? So we start making Facebook posts and Twitter posts and whatever about, and Instagram about nobody had been killed in 10 days. I think we set it around day 8 or so. Day 9, the media reports it as nobody has been killed in Baltimore amid Mayor Pugh not being in office. Like, really? Is that how you're going to tell us? You know what I mean? And so there's like this really insidious way that the news reports about things. And I think, and I don't know, I think there's levels and nuances to it, right? Because I think that as individual people, they are good people at heart. Right? But then there's also a myth that violence is what sells more than positivity. And I think we found with the ceasefire movement that is just not true. Right? That people love eating up these stories about celebrating life all over the city and nobody getting killed or shot or anything. You know, like people want those kind of stories. People have stopped watching the news because it's like the only thing that's good happening is an animal did something good today. Right, on the public interest story at the end of the news. And so I think that not only can they report about it differently, they can come from behind the camera sometimes and get involved in different ways so that they're building credibility in community, they're building trust in community so that when good things are happening, I do know a reporter I can call to talk to who's going to say that this story is worthy of being told on the 6 o'clock news.
There's a report that we can share with you. It's from California that looks at the very question about how the media, and in this case it's print and TV and everything else, talks about these events. And the other thing is to just remember that 2 young people were murdered live on TV reporting a story, the Parker family, that I happened to get to know and to talk about. So the dimensions and the range of this, again, I keep calling it a nightmare because literally I think it is that, but we can share that with you and how they now, with that report, want to start to think about reporting on these events differently, and particularly when they're themselves the victim. Live and on TV, a murder happened in real time with mom and dad watching their daughter reporting a news article. Anybody else want to comment?
I'm a journalism major. I graduated from here in 1983 with my husband. I still wear his press pass wherever I go. Every once in a while I ask him how I'm doing. I think I've asked him a couple times since we've been here. I usually wear it under my shirt, but today I'm wearing it outside. And his colleagues obviously got a lot of attention. The Time Person of the Year was kind of surreal because the people who cared about him are writers and photographers. They tell stories. Yeah. So that's a burden, a curse, and an honor to have his story out there. And I think it's one thing journalists can do is tell the stories of the individual people who are affected, not just the 5 journalists of the Capitol, but everybody. I remember when I was in college, the Washington Post ran a broadsheet page with a photograph, name, and address of each person who had been killed by gun violence this year. I don't think they could do that this year. I don't think there's enough paper. But telling the stories of the people would be a great thing for a journalist to do. And on the other hand, what I'd like to see them do is not be so desperate to tell both sides of the story that you let somebody lie to you. I got angry at the Annapolis Capitol because a couple of days ago they ran a column. It was on the opinion page that said the bill that was defeated at Annapolis would have criminalized gun ownership. The bill said nothing about gun ownership. Gun owners were not affected by the bill. Gun sellers were affected by the bill. And there were lots of exemptions to give your gun to a family member, which isn't always a great idea, to give your gun to a family member. But, okay, Dad wants to take his kid out on a hunting trip on the Eastern Shore. All right, that's an exemption. But they quoted him telling people it criminalized gun ownership. And when I submitted my column and I made an accusation, they called me up and they said, show me where this is true. I said they were making rape jokes about me on Twitter. So I showed him the tweet. So he asked me to substantiate what I was saying, but he apparently didn't ask that guy to substantiate what he was saying. And another legislator said, oh, there were so many problems with the bill, I don't even know where to start. Ask him to start.
Right.
Tell him, show me what you don't like about that bill.
That's right.
So I would like to see, I know journalists these days are so pressured. They want you to get a video of the person. They want you to get the story. They want you to record it while you're writing questions and listening to answers and writing on your computer and tweet about it and get links on your page, clicks on your links. So it's a whole different world out there for journalists. But there's a quote that I like that I use at work that says, we're in a hurry. That means we have to slow down. Because you can't get a story right every time if you're under that kind of pressure all the time. So tell your editor, you're not going to print that crap under your name because it's not true. And you don't need to quote a Second Amendment extremists, and you certainly don't need to clean up their quotes. I saw a video that totally did not align with how this person was quoted. The video showed him looking unhinged. Don't clean it up. Show him who he is. Show us who he is. So I would like to see, on one hand, covering more of this individualized, and on the other hand, getting away from this artificial need to quote both sides when there's no reasonable other side. I mean, if you can find a reasonable other side, fine, but don't print untruths in the name of covering both sides.
The other improvement that I've seen over the last few years in terms of journalism and the media is no notoriety, especially once you saw 20 years ago in Columbine, the two shooters had almost developed a cult following, and you've seen a lot of copycats. And as we've all discussed, gun violence and violence is a disease. So just like many viruses, it's contagious. And the more the media talks about the shooters and who they are, it helps create this following, and it helps create more violence and begets more and more violence. And over the past few years, there's been the notoriety campaign that has really fought against this and worked to educate journalists about that we should stop naming the shooters. Obviously you can have them once to say, who it is, but stop the repetition, stop the fame and the notoriety that we get from that. And I've seen a definite improvement over the last few years, and we definitely saw New Zealand really took this on and showed America how it should look in the shooting of the mosque in Christchurch.
Yeah, they did. And there's recommendations for suicide also, the way to cover suicide. So that's nice to see that general understanding be more well understood.
The last thing I would add is that journalists have an incredible amount of responsibility. And on one end, they bring issues into the living rooms of people who get to clutch their pearls and say, oh, wow, I had no idea this was a thing. But on the other hand, the way that I've seen bleeding black bodies on the news, and the way that we, other and desensitize the deaths of black lives, not only in America, but how we cover genocide in other areas of the world, that to me is a problem. And I think, with the Trayvons and the, Philandos and all those folks, how many times were those clips replayed of these people gasping for breath and begging for their lives? I haven't seen nearly as many white people in that situation on the news in that way. So they have to be discerning in the way that this information is digested, and it might have a backfire effect. Instead of making people sensitive to it, it may in fact desensitize people.
One of the hardest parts.
Can I jump in real quick?
Go ahead,
just
sure.
Because I have to literally walk out of the door. I'm going to do something that's going to make my mother mad. It's my mom's birthday, and I'm taking her to a surprise something. That's my mother right there making the face.
Now there's no surprise?
She's still going to be surprised about where we're going, but she knew we had to leave. So I'm leaving a stack of Baltimore Ceasefire flyers right here. I'm trying to leave enough that you can take a few and give to people. It has the website, the Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can get on our listserv by going to the website, clicking the contact page. Please go to the calendar on the website so that you can come to the Ceasefire weekend, Mother's Day weekend, to participate. I would love for you all over here that said, what are us old people doing? I got to walk out of the door because my mom's birthday is today, and I got to defer to her more than you. I'm sorry. But please send us an email, remind me that I met you here so that we can talk about, you can plan any event you want and have it during the Ceasefire weekend. I would love to see that happen. But you can come, bring people to Baltimore during the Ceasefire weekend. Let your heart guide you to what kind of events you want to go to, or even events that you want to plan yourself. So That's it. Thank y'all so much. I'm really
Thank you,
excited
Erricka.
to be on the panel.
You know, the hardest part about all of this is to, this isn't the end of the conversation. Hopefully we've, got some of the beginning of the conversation here. And one of the things we would, and Andrea mentions it, but we would be, Erin, while she's giving a little thank you to Erricka, and Erricka, you can give it to your mom as a birthday present, from the University of Maryland. But Erin, we want to just mention vulnerability of students on this campus, vulnerability of people in our community, trying to be helpful, people who are at risk. And again, I stand next to my colleague Jeremy here, and whether we recognize signs and symptoms, but Erin, want to take a minute or two to talk about resources on our campus for people who need some help.
This is on campus, but just want to message the importance of care and awareness and speaking up when things don't feel right or seem right. Self-care is really important, and I know in talking with some of the panelists about doing this, when you've experienced trauma, when you continue to experience that as you put forth this effort to do this work, it's just really important that we recognize that, the impact that takes on you, but the importance of continuing on and doing the work too, right? So just want to mention the importance of that for everybody as you find ways to be active, to be activists in this area. But we do have some stuff out on the table, and we have some things from the Health Center about self-care, mental and behavioral health, suicide, and also, reporting. There's mechanisms for getting help for people if you notice there's something that maybe mental health doesn't seem to be going quite right, and helping somebody else get some resources, or if you're starting to notice that there's safety issues, what I'll call red flags. We have a team on campus called the Beta Team where you can report to them, and they're trained to assess what's going on and then get intervention and support, whether it's student, visitor on campus, faculty or staff. But just encouraging you all to make sure you're aware of the resources, that they're there, that doing this work and being in the midst of all of the gun violence can be very challenging and overwhelming, and so being sure that you take good care. So that's it.
And this is a moment to thank Erin and Rachel. Stand up. And Kelly. Without these three people, this incredible event would not have happened, and bringing the talent and the skill to bring all these pieces together in this incredible panel. And Dr. Lushniak and Jordan, one of our wonderful School of Public Health young people, are going to close us out. It's hard to, we're just going to stop for the moment, put it on pause for the moment. It's not an end.
We'll ask for those panelists who are able to stay a little longer to mingle, and certainly for our audience too, to mingle and discuss things further. As discussed earlier, the concept of a sit-in is to what? To expand our horizons a little bit. And thank you to the panelists for sharing oftentimes what's a difficult subject matter to discuss. And the beauty of it is that we expand our horizons by having you here, by welcoming you in this midst, and for us to expand our own knowledge base. It's interesting. I have one of these fancy watches, and as I was sitting there, the fancy watch reminds me things, right? At some point, I feel this buzz in my arm, and it says, breathe, right? It's something I'm doing all the time, but it tells me breathe deeply. And then it says something else occasionally, and it'll say stand, right? I have a reminder. And yet, as I thought about what we're trying to sort of hone in on, is in essence, I should have another one of these warnings that come up and says, do something, right? Do something. Because if there's an essence of activism, it's oftentimes, as we discussed, whether forced into it, whether looking into it, whether reacting to a community, to a personal event, we ultimately are in control of our destiny. And you as students here in particular, we're handing off things to you, right? My generation is handy. I have two daughters who are college-age students who are on the cusp of, of taking over as your generation. They are your part of your generation. And we're handing you things that are somewhat screwed up, right? The planetary issues, the global issues. This is amongst those. But let's work together to make sure that this continues. Do something. To complete this session, I'd like to introduce Jordan Kerr. She's an activist. She's the face of the School of Public Health, and face here is spelled P-H-A-C-E, Public Health Action for Civic Engagement. And so Jordan's going to put together her thoughts from a student's perspective, and then we'll close.
So my name is Jordan. Basically, I'm graduating, so we're looking for new leaders to step in with FACE, but FACE is focused on keeping people not only aware of the issues that are happening around public health and other disciplines as well, but showing them ways that they can get involved as a student and showing them ways that they can get other students involved and keeping the work going. So it's a really good way to introduce you to events like these, introduce you to people like these who can connect you with opportunities and so many opportunities that are available to not only promote and advocate issues like these, but actually make a difference. I want to emphasize, Erin mentioned red flag laws, and if you actually text the number that she mentioned earlier, the 6433 students, they're actually post you regular ways that you can advocate certain issues to your legislators, and they mentioned red flag laws today. So if that's something you support, you can do that right now to text student to 6433. But these are just a number of things that FACE does, and if anyone's interested, I'll hang around and you can give me your information to be a leader.
And they can go to this link.
Yeah.
And give name and email if they want us to email further.
So yeah, you can follow this link here and give your name and email so we can keep the connected. Oh, 64433. Text student to 64433.
Great. Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank you for your attendance today. To our online audience, we hope this was fruitful as well. This is but a beginning of what the School of Public Health wants to bring to this campus, the ability for us to touch those third rails that ultimately influence the public's health. That includes preventing death, disease, and injury, with the idea that we are promoting health and wellness, and the ultimate goal of public health is prolonging a high quality of life. If this issue doesn't fit into those categories, I don't know what does as a public health issue. I thank you to the panelists for what you brought today to our community, and I thank you to the community for being part of this critical event. The discussion will continue. We as educators, this is specifically to the students, aren't here to tell you what to think, how to think, right? Part of your education here is to process information so you come up with your own opinions. But at the end of the day, the key is do something. Do something. Believe in something and do something. Thank you so much for being part of this teaching.